Thank you, Provost O'Meara, for that nice introduction. I'm going to tell you about my research for the past 35 years. The last 25 years of that research I've spent at TC. And I just want to say really quickly that I couldn't imagine a better place to do what I do. A lot of what I did early on in my career was quite controversial. There was a lot of pushback, ruffled more than a few feathers. And TC gave me a home to really expand that work. And there's really true academic and intellectual freedom, unprecedented, really. And I feel like I'm not sure I could have done some of the things that I was doing in my research if I wasn't here. So that was really important in my career. I'm going to begin with this slide. Bad things happen, and I'm sure you've noticed that. Bad things are happening. These are the kind of things that we just dread in our lives. These are the kind of things that are frightening to us. We don't want them to happen to us, but they do happen, and we know that they can cause harm. They can cause trauma. So we talk about these things as traumas. But interestingly, the epidemiological research, the epidemiological research, large-scale survey studies has shown very clearly that most people will experience at least one event like this, and often several during the course of their lives. So that raises the question, what do we mean when we say these are traumas? It also raises all kinds of questions about resilience. What would resilience be? So that's what I want to talk with you about today. I'm going to talk about 3 axioms of resilience that are essentially 3 facets of this idea of resilience that are pretty well scientifically established now. One, and some of these may be a little surprising, resilience to potential trauma and other difficult things is very common. 2, it's not a type of person. Resilience is not a type of person. It's not about having the right key traits. 3, what does seem to help resilience to come about is what I'm calling flexible adaptation, or regulatory flexibility, flexible self-regulation. We can call it lots of different things, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a bit. So we'll start with the first. Resilience to potential trauma is common. When I began my career 35 years ago, this is about 1990, 1991, the way people thought about these kinds of events was binary. You either had PTSD or prolonged grief, or you didn't, or depression, or you didn't. So it was just the 2 categories that we were thinking of. And that's very limited in many ways. And you can really see how limited it is when we look at this graphically. So at the bottom there, I have a PTE, which is the phrase I use, a potentially traumatic event, a continuum of time, and then a continuum on the vertical axis of health. So health to poor health, or low symptoms and distress to high symptoms and distress. If we look at something like chronic PTSD, it would look like that. High levels of symptoms and distress that go up and down a little bit, but they stay high. If it's chronic, this person is suffering for a long time. If we know that in a binary model, everybody else is in the only remaining category, which doesn't really have a name. Non-PTSD, health, resilience, none of those words really capture this. And we can also see when we look at this graphically, very importantly, we don't know where people are in that space. And I've argued if we don't know what's going on with people who don't develop PTSD or depression or grief, how can we help people who do? We don't understand it. So this was something, when I began my career, this was the state of affairs, and I was very interested in this. This was also kind of assumed, this area, and I was particularly interested in this area. I'm not sure exactly why, but I got interested in this. Down at the bottom there were people who don't really show any real major reaction at all, no long-term consequences at all. And at the time, that was considered rare, and in some circles, pathological. People were thinking, what is wrong with those people? Why are they not showing trauma reactions? So I was really fascinated by this, and I decided to get into studying that. And for the next 35 years, I didn't realize it would be 35 years later, I'd still be studying this. But instead of using that binary model, which we can do, we can easily categorize people that way, we decided to try to understand the heterogeneity, the very different kinds of reactions people have. And what we ended up discovering was that there were these a number of prototypical trajectories that we could find in the data. So if we go back to this graph, what we did see always a chronic trajectory, and that's like PTSD or depression or grief, but we're not categorizing anybody. Particularly, we're just identifying people that are clustering around that line at the top. You can see the prevalence. Then we also discovered this pattern was quite prevalent. We call this a recovery trajectory. And both of these two groups together, it's very interesting. They both start off with this acute kind of reaction, but one group gets better and the other continues to suffer. Why? There's been still very little research, not enough research to try to tease that out. Then we discovered this group, which we call a worsening group, sometimes delayed. Now, there's a classic idea of a delayed PTSD reaction or a delayed grief reaction, where people seem healthy, but they're really not, and then out of nowhere comes this boom, this reaction. That doesn't actually happen. We don't see it in any systematic way. What we do see, and what other researchers have seen, is that pattern, which is somebody's struggling, they're getting by, but they're struggling, and then they keep getting a little bit worse. And at some point, if you have only these two categories, they cross the line, and it looks like they have PTSD out of nowhere. But in fact, it's more like that. So those you can see the prevalence that we see. These is replicated many, many times, these patterns in the data. What about this area down here where it's assumed there wouldn't be many people? Now, you may already realize where I'm going with this. When we actually looked, and if there's anything that I've done that's a contribution, is that we actually just looked and see. We got a lot of people so we could check that out. And it turns out this is where most people are. This is the trajectory we found over and over. It's usually the majority in every study. See a little bit of a blip at the beginning. Most people get pretty upset when a hard event happens. And sometimes they have nightmares or they have intrusive thoughts. That's incredibly normal initially. And this group might get a little upset, but otherwise they show a stable trajectory of healthy functioning. That's actually a better word. We call it the resilience trajectory. Stable trajectory, healthy functioning is a more descriptive way to talk about it. You just can't make an acronym out of that. And if you can think of one, please let me know. I've never been able to do it. Okay, so this is what we've seen now over and over and over in about 100 studies now. Whoops, yeah. Now here are just a few recent studies. I'm going to go through this quickly just to give you a flavor. The ones on the left with an asterisk come from my lab. Other people started using the approach that we use, and now it's quite common. On the right, you can see the types of events that were covered in these studies. Pretty nasty things: mass shootings, spinal cord injury, combat deployment, traumatic injury, life-threatening medical events, etc. And we've studied a lot of these things, and other people have studied them. In all these studies, you can see that the resilience trajectory, that trajectory at the bottom of the graph, is the most common. Recently, our lab and another group have put together reviews of all the studies. These two reviews together captured 89 studies. It's now about 100 studies. The study on the graph on the left, that's the study that we did, the review we did, a meta-analysis it's called. And we had 63 studies done before COVID, and a German team looked at the research done during COVID. You know, everybody was at their computer during COVID, so we got a lot of research done. And so there were 26 studies done during COVID. What's interesting about looking at these together is that the prevalence of that resilience trajectory is almost identical. And early on in COVID, if you remember, people were wringing their hands and saying this is going to be the worst mental health crisis we've ever seen. It's going to overwhelm our coping resources, overwhelm our mental health resources. And it did not. It was stressful, but it did not produce the kind of outcomes people thought. There were even some studies during COVID, there were 6 of them that looked at youth. Now, of course, the way this impacted children and adolescents is complicated, and there were definitely impacts, but these trajectories revealed that the children were just as resilient in general as adults were. Okay, so why do we see these patterns at the prevalence we do? Why are so many people resilient? Why isn't everybody resilient? How do we know when somebody's going to be resilient? This is the common answer to that question. We see this whenever anything major happens. You start seeing articles like this, see magazines, shows, sometimes even the professional journals. the 3 traits of highly resilient people, the 5 traits, the 7 traits. Now, right away, you should notice the numbers 3, 5, and 7. That should make you a little suspicious. These are fairy tale numbers. Like 7 dwarves, 3 brothers go off on a quest, etc. So it makes it's a little too neat and tidy. And it's wrong also. Why do I say that? This is my second point. Resilience is not a type, and having the key traits alone will not make you resilient. Now, the reason I say that is when we actually look at what correlates with these trajectories, and we've had big data sets and small data sets where we could do this, we don't find 3, 5, or 7. We find 50 different variables or more, 60 variables. I'm just going to let this run out. These are just some of the factors that we see. They're all generally good things that we find correlating, but there are lots and lots of them. It's going to run out. It's going to keep going. That took me about 2 hours to make that. So you can see there are lots of these factors. This is only some of them. They're basically good things, but there's so many of them. How do we understand this? How do we make sense of this? Who's resilient and who not? If we know all these things are going on, it gets even more complicated when we realize scientifically that the effect sizes are small. And what that means, that's a statistical phrase, but what it basically means is that each one of these things only explains a little bit, a very tiny bit of who will be resilient. It only moves the needle just a little bit. And that's what I call the resilience paradox. Now, if we look at it graphically with a pie, the idealized pie that's sort of widely assumed looks something like that. We think these big slices that are going to explain who's resilient and who not, and we should have some of these and maybe we can cultivate them. But if that's quite idealized. The realistic pie looks more like that. The slices are very small. And even when we can do machine learning, which we've done a few machine learning, seeing what if we measure a whole bunch of things, our prediction improves. We can predict more of the pie, but sometimes not even half. And the slices actually get smaller because, just to excuse if I nerd out for a second, if you use a multivariate model and all these things are looked at together, they overlap a lot because they're all good things, so the actual contribution of any one of these factors even shrinks. So we don't really get an answer to this question. So the paradox is really, we know these correlates, but we still can't predict who will be resilient and who not. But more importantly, we don't understand what's happening. We don't know what the mechanism is. What is it that people are doing? And this is not telling us. All this research on these factors was not telling us an answer to that, just telling us that there are lots of different factors. So I think we can solve the paradox, and I think we are now solving it. That's maybe a little too bold, but I'm going to tell you now, if I can, how we think this works. We start with things that we know. One of the things we know is that all the different situations we're confronted with are different. They present us with different challenges. When we look at these things that cause trauma reactions, they cause grief, they cause depression, we tend to think that they're all kind of the same. If they cause PTSD, they must all be traumas, and therefore they're the same, but they're not the same at all. The challenges they present are very different. Coping with a hurricane is very different than coping with a terrorist attack. It presents you with a very different task. It's very different than coping with abuse or loss or a medical emergency or the kind of things we're coping with right now, which shall go nameless. These are all challenges, and they're all very different, and coping with them is very different. On top of that, they change over time. The same event will change over time. How we react initially, we might feel kind of numbness. We might feel like aroused, anxious. We're not sure what's going on, a little confused. That might give way to nightmares. A few nightmares, as I said before, are not uncommon. And I can talk about that later if anyone's interested. It's a kind of adaptive thing our mind does. Intrusive images, that might give way to a sense of apprehension. We might restrict our activities. We might think this is going to happen again. One thing that happens a lot now is people begin to worry they have PTSD. And that makes them even more anxious. There's a kind of a widespread interest in this now, and people get anxious. Do I have PTSD? So all this is happening, and we know this, that the situational challenges, they vary across events and within the same event across time. Another thing we know is that everything we do, all the costs and all the things we do to respond, the traits and behaviors that we do, including the things that resilient people do, have costs and benefits. You see this everywhere in nature. Everything in nature has costs and benefits. Everything, all animals in nature, their behaviors show costs and benefits. And this is really common. Now, one of my favorite examples of this is the peacock's tail. Now, those of you who have been around TC know that for a while there were 3 peacocks at the Cathedral of Church of St. John the Divine on the campus grounds. They're not there anymore, unfortunately. I don't know if people know that. But they're remarkable birds. Everybody can agree, regardless of how you feel about them, they're pretty remarkable birds. Now, here's a quote from Charles Darwin. The sight of a feather at a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Now, why would he say that? Why would Charles Darwin say that? The key to why he was saying that is the date. He was writing this in a letter. He wrote this in a letter to Asa Gray, who was a botanist, 1860. In 1859, he published The Origin of Species, which is his first major tome on evolutionary theory. He'd been writing that book for about 20 years, but he was reluctant to publish it because he knew it was going to cause a huge firestorm, a huge controversy. He was a very shy man. He didn't want that. He didn't want this to happen, which is what happened. He was very religious, too. At the time, the only explanation for the diversity of species on Earth was that God did it. And Darwin was essentially saying, not exactly. You could actually make that work, but people weren't doing that at the time. So the way his evolutionary theory works is that if a behavior or a trait helps this creature to survive, it becomes part of the creature's genome. He didn't know about genes quite yet, but it becomes part of that creature if it helps them survive, and it gets passed down through its offspring. Then there's this peacock. How could this help the peacock survive? And this is why it made Darwin sick, because he put his life on the line, he put his happiness on line for this idea, and there's this peacock that kept telling him, how does, this basically, he's got this huge tail that says to any predator, over here. And it's a big bird, right? And the creatures that like to eat peacocks also know that it can't fly very well. So this was really a puzzle for Darwin that really bugged him because it was messing up his life. And here was this example that said, maybe you're not right about this idea. So it took him 12 years to sort it out. Here's a clue to how he solved the problem. He introduced a second evolutionary mechanism. In addition to survival of the fittest, you could call this survival of the hottest, maybe, I don't know. But what he did was he called it sexual selection. Here's another quote. Females, meaning the peahen, have unconsciously, by the continued preference for the most beautiful males, rendered the peacock the most splendid species of living bird. In other words, the tails attract females, and birds do this, some other creatures do it, and the better the tail, the more likely to, and they're more likely to pass on their genes through sex. So that's what they're doing. So this, by introducing these two mechanisms, Darwin solidified costs and benefits in evolutionary theory. There's a benefit to this tail because the peacock is more likely to reproduce with a better tail, and that its offspring will inherit that tail, and the tail will get better and better and better. But the cost is that it doesn't promote survival at all. It puts the creature at risk of predation. Here's another quick example, the cheetah's speed. Cheetah are incredible creatures. There are 2 cheetah in the Bronx Zoo. They're beautiful. They are the fastest terrestrial mammals. They can get up to 60 miles an hour in 3 seconds. They look like a perfect creature. They have teeth and claws. They eat meat, and looks like they could just lie around on the savannah. When they get hungry, they get up and run something down, eat it, and go back to sleep. But there's a cost. This is the benefit of speed, but there's a cost to speed. Would anybody like to guess what the cost of speed is? Energy? It's almost, that's just about it. It takes so much metabolism, so much energy, so much caloric energy to get up to that speed that they can only do it for 30 seconds. So they have no stamina. Usain Bolt can only run as fast as he runs for 20 seconds. He doesn't run marathons. So there's a cost to the speed, and tracking studies have shown that most of the time when cheetah try to run down a prey, they don't catch it, because the things they want to eat don't have to outrun them. They only have to outrun them for 30 seconds. And they've developed their own strategies to do that. So now when we bring this back to humans, the same cost and benefit analysis applies to everything humans do. And we talk a lot about emotion regulation, how we control ourselves. How we talk a lot about emotion regulation as a key to a successful adolescence. And we know a lot about these emotion regulation strategies that humans use. For example, there are strategies that we consider maladaptive. These are things that are kind of avoidant, like distraction or suppression, not dealing with it. And that's generally thought, that's not good, that's not an adaptive thing to do. But very good research now shows that in some situations, that's exactly what helps us get through it. It's very adaptive. If we flip it the other way, things that we think are very, very good behaviors, like reappraisal, which is essentially reframing, finding meaning, getting support from other people, these are good things, good, healthy things to do, but there's good research, again, showing that in some situations, these are not helpful and sometimes even harmful. So we put this together, and what it leads to this sort of obvious conclusion that what works in one situation doesn't always work in another situation, or in the same situation at another point in time. And that's why the effects are so small. It took us a while to figure this out. We had one of those Homer Simpson kind of moments. That's why the effects are so small. Because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And when you average it, you get a very small overall effect. So here's a kind of a non-behavioral example. We have a challenge. We need to saw that piece of wood right along that line. Forgive the wood sawing metaphor. I'm doing a lot of wood stuff these days, so I like this one. But we need to saw right along that line. We have two tools. We have a handsaw and a chainsaw. The handsaw will do a very nice job of cutting that wood right along that line. That's what it's designed to do. The chainsaw will also cut that wood. It'll cut it even faster. And it'll cut it along that line, but a chainsaw is about 3/8 of an inch thick. So you can't get a good bead. And it's also big and heavy, and it's vibrating a lot. You're not going to get a very accurate cut. So the chainsaw will cut too, but it won't do a very good job. On the other hand, if we need to saw a log, if the challenge is different, the chainsaw is perfect for that. That's what it was designed for. And we can also do it with a handsaw, but that will take a long time. Believe me, I've tried. And it also it'll bind up because the saw will get hot from the friction, and it will bind up in the wood. So the handsaw doesn't do a very good job. So two tools, two tasks, only one of them works really well for the outcome. So we take this now to the third point, which is what I began to talk with, the first point I began to talk with. Most people are resilient. So this suggests most people must be able to work this out. And most people must be flexible enough to work this out. And that means that they can work out what's the right behavior in this situation at this time. And that leads to my third point. Resilience comes about through flexible self-regulation. We first did this after 9/11. We had people who were in the towers and near the towers, and we had some students, and we did different samples. And is that telling me something, or is that just somebody's phone going off? We measured people's ability to express a lot of emotion. We also measured their ability to suppress emotion. And it turned out the healthiest people after 9/11, over the next 2 years after 9/11, this was a longitudinal study, the healthiest people were the people who could do both of those things. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. So the people who could express a lot of emotion weren't necessarily doing well 2 years later unless they could also suppress emotion. That's what the study showed. So we kept doing this kind of stuff. Then about 10 years ago, my student here at the time, Chuck Burton, and I put together this model for what flexibility was, and we've since been fine-tuning this, and this is what we've been working on really a lot since then. And part of that model is something called the flexibility sequence. It's fairly elaborate, but I'll just give you a quick run-through of what this is. All of this comes from experimental research and large-scale work, other kinds of studies, lots of data. And the flexibility sequence, as we understand it now, is a sequence of steps people go through to work out what's the right behavior for the right situation at the right time. It begins with something called context sensitivity. We learn this when we're kids. Our teachers, our parents begin to teach us we behave differently in different situations. You walk into a room, you walk into this room, you first kind of assess how does one behave in this room, right? In New York, we go in the subway. And I love the subway example. There's all kinds of cues in the subway. Why are there no people here? Why are there people here? What's that sign say? Why are those people looking this way? There's all these things we try to pick up. Where's the train? But when something difficult happens to us, we have to ask ourselves, what is happening right now? What's this situation I'm in? And we have to keep it fairly narrow. You know, say I'm suffering, looks like I'm suffering from PTSD. Well, that's a big problem. But we can think, what's bothering me right now in this moment? Is it I'm not sleeping well? I'm anxious. I'm having images. I'm worried about what's going to happen. Whatever it is, we focus in on that. What's happening? What do I need to do? We kind of set the goal. Right, I'm going to deal with that. Then we move to the second step, where we choose a strategy, some behavior that we use. We often don't even do this consciously. We just kind of do this somewhat automatically, but it really helps if we go through this consciously. But here the question is different. Not only what do I need to do, but what am I able to do? And we're beginning to develop some trainings on this stuff where we teach people, what are the strategies that you have? And it's a good idea to try to work that out. What strategies do I actually have? So we choose a strategy, and we go to this third step that has been generally overlooked in psychology, and we're trying to change that. We ask ourselves, is this working? Which is very natural, but it's something that's not been researched much. And it turns out people fail a lot in this step because we ascertained, is this working? And if it's not helping, a lot of people just give up. They say, I can't deal with this. I tried this thing I always do, and it didn't work. I can't deal with this. But in this flexibility model, which we know that people do this when they get through events, we go back to the repertoire and we choose another behavior. So we try a second strategy. And again, we ask, is this working? Maybe it didn't work the second time. We go back again. We might try a third, trial and error. Maybe after the third time, we might decide to go back to the beginning and redefine the problem. Maybe the problem's too big, or I'm not focusing on the right problem. But in any case, generally this is something that people can get through and that helps them get through these events. Now, I went through that very quickly. I just gave you the cursory review on it, but there's a lot to this. But this is this basic piece, plus there's a motivational piece too, which I didn't tell you about, that goes with this. Okay, quickly, resilience to potential trauma is common. I showed you that typically it's the majority response, so many people are always going to be resilient. Secondly, it's not a type. It's not about having the key traits, because there aren't any key traits. There's so many of them, and they all have small effects. And third, the way we seem to get through these events is by flexibly adapting ourselves to the challenge in the moment. We work out the right behavior for the right situation at the right time, and we correct as needed. And that's the heart of flexibility. I want to quickly thank all the people that have paid for this work over the years. Funding is important. That seems to be an issue right now. Up at the top right is David and Maureen O'Connor funded us most recently to do the Resilience Center for Veterans and Families. And that's been a wonderful thing that we're working on now, and we really appreciate that. Shamelessly, I want to tell you about this book, which is published a few years ago, which basically summarizes all this stuff. My lab and my email are at the bottom. Thank you for your time.
George, thank you so much. We have some questions that have been submitted, so I'm just going to go ahead and run our Q&A. With so many global stressors, climate anxiety, political division, conflict, how should we be shifting the public conversation about mental health and resilience?
That's a big question. I think there's some basic things that people need to do you don't hear about it much. And it's a little counterintuitive, and it's tricky also, which is turning it off at times. Because you can make yourself crazy. as many of us know, right? You can find yourself. I have a rule with my wife. When either one of us says, "Do you know what happened today?" and if you go like this, you can't say it, right? Because otherwise right now I'm thinking about something else. I don't want to think about that, because you just end up getting yourself really messed up for the next hour or two. So there's a lot of that, and we all look on our phones and our computers all the time, and we need to know what's happening. And there's some pretty good research actually saying that if you completely tune out, that's not working either, because then we don't participate in the conversation. But we need to know what's happening, and enough, and that's it. And the media, our brains are wired for threat. They're not wired for good things. We perceive good things and we're rewarded for good things, but our brains are wired for immediate response to threat, because evolutionary, that makes a lot of sense. And the media implicitly or explicitly knows that. All media, all social media, all those things, of course, the internet's monetized now, right? And so there's advertising money comes from clicks, from attention. And so the more attention that can be grabbed, the more money is made. And so the internet wants us to be upset. I hate to put it that way, but the internet really wants us to look at this stuff. And there's plenty of it. So we really have to, I think part of the conversation we need to have is, how do we deal with that? I'm not particularly in favor of saying, this is all not allowed. I think it's more that we need to just basically think about how these things affect us and how we can control our lives and take back some of our own agency in these things.
Our next question is, how can we foster flexibility in young people who perhaps haven't yet faced or don't remember major adversity?
That's interesting. Well, it's interesting in fostering flexibility in that part that I talked about. Is that something that kids come to over time? And adolescents come to this a little bit late, right? Because they're going through adolescence. So they really need to, it's a little harder to inculcate these things in adolescence, because they're struggling with a lot of imbalances now, neuroanatomical changes happening that make adolescents, younger people, more impulsive, less regulated than other times in their lives. Then part of the question was how to children who haven't gone through major things.
Or don't perhaps remember the major things.
Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't met any kids who don't remember the major things. I mean, so many kids of the last few generations have gone through all kinds of stuff. So I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that part. I mean, there are things that we went through or other generations that they haven't, but they've gone through their own pretty nasty things. Then my daughter is Gen Z. And she used to always say all the things that I think are not true about trauma and things like that. And now she says the opposite. So she got through it, and now she's older, and she's more in a position to understand that. So it's a little tricky in that regard. But I think the younger generations have gone through a lot of stuff.
And along the lines also around children and youth, but a little bit older, are there any suggestions on activities to be included during teenagers and into young adulthood that could perhaps help individuals be their flexible selves?
I'm not a developmental psychologist. I give you that by way of excuse. I think that giving kids more space this is going to be maybe a little bit missing the mark of the question, but giving kids more space to make mistakes is really important. We haven't been very good at that, I think. But that's how we learn. And the literature on adolescence, the psychology literature and the neuroscience literature suggests that parents who are warm and supportive, but also allowing kids to warm and supportive, and what was the third thing? That's probably why I was not the best father. I can't remember the third thing. What's that? There was a third piece of that, but in other words, just allowing your children to make mistakes, helping them understand what happened, and any kind of activity that allows that, from sports to chess club or any of those other things, allowing kids to try it and fail, and then helping them understand what happened. That was the best I would say about that.
Okay. Wonderful. George, thank you very much for joining us today and for your